All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for making time today. My name is Geraldine. I am a consultant at Ecosustainability. Over the next hour, we are going to unpack the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, not as an abstract piece of EU regulation, but as something with a very direct line to your bottom line. The central idea we'll keep coming back to is this: how you measure greenhouse gas emissions today determines how much you pay under CBAM tomorrow. And that number is now becoming a factor in whether EU buyers will even sign a contract with you. We'll walk through the mechanics briefly, spend time on a case study of a company navigating exactly this, and finish with a practical playbook you can start applying this quarter. Before we begin, here is a short video on eco-sustainability. Eco-sustainability is a consulting firm headquartered in Singapore. We have over 21 consultants, and we are present in five other countries, namely Malaysia, the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, and Cambodia. Our main service is reporting. As most of you know, sustainability reporting has become mandatory in many countries in the region. We also do consulting to help companies decarbonize. We manage carbon credit projects and are currently developing 3 carbon credit projects in Indonesia. We do trainings and partner with universities and learning institutes to deliver courses to professionals, SMEs, and large corporations. We also have a think tank arm called the Climate Policy Lab, where we do active standard contribution work at the global level. We work across 22 standards such as ISSB, SASB, ISO 14064 for GHG reporting, ISO 14067 for product carbon footprint, and ISO 14068 for carbon neutrality, covering everything from ESG disclosure to GHG reporting, carbon neutrality, and product carbon footprint. In summary, we work with all the standards listed on your screen, including assurance. This slide is our pride and passion, where we do work for a think tank, the Climate Policy Lab. All consultants at Eco-Sustainability are not just standards users, but are standards contributors. As you know, there are global standard setters like ISSB, SASB, SBTI, VERA, GHG Protocol, and so forth. Then there are standards users, for example, preparers who write reports, auditors, regulators, and corporations who follow the rules. And there's a unique group of people who sit in between, like us, who provide technical commentary to help co-develop these standards. Today, you're learning from a group of people who have helped shape the standards. Just a few housekeeping notes. This session is being recorded for learning purposes, and please keep your microphones muted to ensure clear audio, but feel free to leave your videos on. Questions are welcome throughout the talk, and you may post them in the chat box. Here's the shape of our session. First, a fast recap of CBAM mechanics and why the scope keeps expanding. I'll keep this brief since many of you already have the basics. Second, and this is the heart of the talk, the model that links your emissions data to your financial exposure to your decarbonization strategy. Think of this as the thesis statement for everything that follows. Third, we'll ground all of that in a real published case study, Needle and Coughlin, Asia's CBAM Readiness Program, and an illustrative work example showing exactly how the euros move. And finally, a practical playbook, concrete steps you can take to reduce your exposure and protect your margins. Feel free to jot down questions as we go. We'll leave room for discussion at the end, but don't hesitate to post your questions in the chat box if something needs immediate clarification. Mm, okay. Let's ground everyone with the basics in under a minute. I told you I'll keep this brief. CBAM exists to prevent carbon leakage. That's the technical term for what happens when production simply relocates to countries with weaker climate rules to dodge the cost of carbon at home. The mechanism is straightforward in concept. Importers bringing covered goods in the EU must purchase CBAM certificates that match the carbon emissions embedded in those goods. Today, that covers steel, aluminum, cement, fertilizers, hydrogen, and electricity, as we'll see in a moment, and that list is only growing. The underlying goal is fairness, a level playing field between EU producers who already pay for their emissions under the EU emissions trading system and non-EU exporters who historically haven't. On the right, you can see the simple flow. A non-EU producer needs CBAM certificates to clear the EU border and reach the market. This is the timeline everyone in this room needs internalized because the regulatory net is widening fast. The transitional period ran through 2025, reporting only no certificates purchased yet. But don't let the word transitional fool you. The data you collected becomes the baseline the EU will hold you to in the definitive period, which began in 2026, when certificate purchases start and the EU's own free allowances begin phasing out. At the same time, scope is expanding. Roughly 180 new downstream product codes were added in 2026 alone. And by 2030, the EU intends to cover nearly all sectors under its own emissions trading system. By 2024, CBAM is fully phased in, 100% of embedded emissions covered, zero free allocation left anywhere. If your product isn't covered today, there's a good chance it will be soon. Before we get into the model, let's ground ourselves in the actual scale of this thing with some real numbers. CBAM covered goods already made up 4.7% of total EU imports back in 2023. And the 2026 downstream expansion adds a further 2.5% on top of that. So this is not a niche policy. It touches a meaningful slice of everything entering the European market. On the pricing side, we now have a real number to anchor to. The European Commission published the first official quarterly CBAM certificate price on April 7, 2026, at €75 and 36 cents per ton of carbon dioxide for the first quarter's imports. That's very close to the €80 figure we'll use as a round illustrative number later in the session. If you look at the pie chart on the left, you can see where the volume actually sits. Iron and steel alone is 58% of CBAM covered import volume, aluminum is 26%, and electricity, which spiked to 14% back in 2022 during the energy crisis, has settled back to 7%. If you're in steel or aluminum, you're squarely in the center of this policy, not on its edges. Now, which countries are actually most exposed? This chart comes directly from the European Commission's own analysis of the 2026 downstream expansion proposal, and it's revealing. China is the most exposed trading partner by a wide margin, with an estimated 18 billion euros a year in additional downstream exports newly brought into scope. Turkey follows at 8 billion, then the United States at 6 billion, the United Kingdom at 5 billion, and Japan at 3 billion. But raw export value doesn't tell the whole story. Look at Turkey specifically. Separately from this downstream expansion figure, Turkey is already the EU's single largest steel supplier, shipping around 6 million tons a year, and critically, it doesn't yet have a domestic carbon price equivalent to the EU's own trading system, which means very little of that exposure can be offset. If we zoom into a different sector entirely, the Gulf states, particularly Bahrain in the UAE, They carry the highest exposure in aluminum, both in absolute euro terms and notably relative to the size of their economies. Exposure isn't just about the size of country's economy. It's about how carbon intensive their specific exports to the EU happen to be. Let's bring this closer to home for this room specifically, because ASEAN exposure is genuinely uneven and the data backs that up precisely. Vietnam is the most exposed economy in this slide. The EU is its third largest export market, representing 14.4% of its total exports. And within that, iron and steel alone makes up 96% of Vietnam's CBAM relevant export value to the EU. That's about as concentrated as exposure gets. Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand all carry elevated exposure too, largely because their electricity grids remain coal-heavy, which drives up embedded emissions across everything they manufacture. Now, the Philippines specifically, the direct exposure is genuinely low. Only 1.6% of CBAM covered products go to the EU market at all, with cement as the most exposed sector. But low doesn't mean zero. And the gravity model projections are specific. An estimated 15% decline in cement exports to the EU and an 11.6% decline in iron and steel exports, worth roughly $1 million and $5.3 million a year respectively. Those numbers are small in absolute terms compared to Vietnam, but they're real and they compound over time. And notice Singapore in the corner of this story. It's comparatively well positioned precisely because it already has a functioning carbon price and mature reporting infrastructure. That's not luck. That's what being prepared looks like in practice. And it's exactly the position this session is trying to help you get to. I want to end this numbers section on a genuinely encouraging note because it directly validates everything we're about to build the rest of this session around. Back in 2023, only 8% of CBAM reports use actual verified emissions data. The rest defaulted to the EU's punitive assumptions. By mid-2025, that number had risen to 53%. That's 6.5 times increase in 2 years. What changed wasn't the regulation. It's that importers started working directly and closely with their suppliers to get real emissions information instead of accepting default values as an unavoidable cost of doing business. This matters enormously for what we're about to discuss because it means this approach isn't some theoretical best practice we're recommending to you. It is rapidly becoming the market norm. The suppliers still relying on default values in 2026 are increasingly the exception, not the rule. And that gap is exactly where cost and competitive disadvantage concentrate. Okay, this slide is the spine of everything we're going to talk about today, so I want to spend a moment on it. There are 3 steps, and they happen in this order always. Step 1, measure. You calculate your embedded emissions that are direct scope 1 emissions from fuel and process, plus your indirect scope 2 emissions from purchased electricity expressed per ton of product. Step 2, expose. That emissions number gets multiplied by the gap between the EU's carbon price and whatever carbon price you've already paid at home, and that calculation is literally your CBAM certificate bill. Step 3, decarbonize. Once you see that your cost is a direct function of your emissions intensity, the path forward becomes obvious. Lower intensity means fewer certificates, means lower cost, means a more competitive bid. The callout at the bottom is the line I want you to remember. If you don't provide verified data, the EU doesn't guess in your favor. It defaults to its most expensive assumption. Right. Let's get concrete on step 1, how embedded emissions actually get calculated, because the details matter enormously for what you report. Direct or scope 1 emissions are what happens on site. Fuel combustion and process emissions like calcination or reduction reactions, depending on your sector. Indirect or scope 2 emissions come from electricity, steam, or heat you purchase to run your process. Together, these get reported as specific embedded emissions, tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per ton of product using the EU's insulation level methodology, which is conceptually aligned with the GHG protocol many of you already use for corporate reporting. The piece that catches people off guard is the last bullet. Precursor materials cascade forward. If you buy iron ore or semi-finished steel from a supplier, their emissions become embedded in your number. This is exactly why supplier data quality becomes a strategic issue and not just an accounting footnote. We'll come back to this in the playbook. Now, here's a concept that I think is underappreciated, and it can cost companies real money, the default value penalty. If you don't submit verified actual data, the EU doesn't leave the number blank. It applies a default value, an assumed emissions intensity based on the product and country of origin. And critically, that default value is deliberately calibrated to sit above the average performer in the reference dataset. It is designed to be unattractive. Look at the chart. An efficient producer reporting actual data pays around 112 euros per ton in this illustration. An average producer paying actual data pays around 168 euros, but the EU default value comes in at 240 euros, meaningfully higher than even the average performer. The takeaway I want to land here is simple. Reporting accurately is not a compliance checkbox. It is a pricing decision with real euros attached. Let's make the formula itself completely explicit because everything downstream depends on understanding these three inputs. CBAM certificates owed equals your embedded emissions in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent multiplied by the EU ETS price minus whatever carbon price you've already paid at home. The middle box, embedded emissions, is what we just discussed. It's yours to measure and improve. The EU ETS price is market-driven and largely out of your control, though it's worth tracking since it moves with the broader carbon market. The home carbon price is a credit. If your country already has a domestic carbon tax or trading scheme, that amounts that amount gets subtracted, so it directly reduces your bill. The chart at the bottom drives the point home visually. Hold the ETS price constant and your cost per ton scales directly and linearly with your emissions intensity. Low intensity, low cost. High intensity, high cost. This is the lever you actually control. Now, let's ground everything we've discussed in a real published case study. This is Lidl and Kaufland Asia, LKA, the Hong Kong-based sourcing arm of Lidl International, which sources food and non-food products from factories across 11 Asian markets. This case is documented by Reset Carbon, an LRQA company. LKA's ambition was to assess CBAM data availability across its Asian supply chain and quantify its financial exposure by product and by supplier. The challenge wasn't figuring out which products were in scope. They already knew that. The hard part, which is the same hard part every one of you faces, was collecting accurate data across a vast supplier base without a manageable resource burden. Now, I want to flag something important. LKA sits on the buyer side of this relationship. It's an EU retailer sourcing office, not an exporter. But its problem is the mirror image of yours. It needs verified data from its supplier, or it defaults to the EU's most expensive assumption. That means the suppliers who can provide clean data become preferred partners, and the suppliers who can't become exactly the kind of weak link recent carbon had to go chase down. This is directly relevant no matter which side of the relationship you sit on. Here's how Reset Carbon actually started this program in four phases. First, supplier segmentation. They use purchase volumes combined with CBAM default data to find out exactly where emissions risk was concentrated across LKA's enormous supply base, rather than treating every supplier as equally important. Second, supplier training. And notice they didn't use a one-size-fits-all approach. On-site sessions for the many suppliers based in China, but a tailored one-on-one webinar for the single largest supplier located outside China, because that relationship warranted individual attention. Third, data collection. They built a standardized template that captured factory-level process data and automatically calculated emissions in the exact format the EU requires, backed by a help desk so suppliers weren't left guessing. And fourth, a CBAM CBAM summary report that quantified the gap between primary data and default values in real euros and gave LKA a baseline to forecast future exposure as import volume shift. This is a genuinely replicable playbook, and it maps directly onto the MRV tips we'll cover later in this session. This is the most important finding from recent carbon segmentation work. 10% of LKA's in-scope products accounted for over 80% of their CBAM-relevant emissions. That risk was concentrated in just 14 suppliers. And when they look even closer, 5 key suppliers alone represented 85% of emissions across 5 quarters of data. Sit with that for a second. This isn't a story about needing perfect data from hundreds of suppliers. It's a story about finding a handful of suppliers who actually matter and focusing intensely there. This pattern isn't unique to LKA or to retail. Emissions risks almost never spread evenly across a supply base. Whichever side of this relationship we're on, the lesson is the same. Find your 5 suppliers and put your engagement energy exactly there. So what did this program actually deliver? 4 concrete real outcomes. First, it reduced the data burden dramatically. Instead of chasing primary data from every single supplier, Reset Carbon narrowed the list down to that uh, 10 that critical 10% that actually required it. Second, all of the key suppliers got trained on how to report CBAM data correctly, not generically, but in the specific format the EU registry requires. Third, they collected full on-site data for every relevant Tier 3 production site behind LKA's in-scope products, not estimates, not proxies, actual factory-level data. And fourth, they produce a consolidated report showing detailed CBAM exposure broken down by both supplier and by both product and by supplier, which is now LK's baseline for forecasting as trade volume shift. Looking ahead, this foundation sets up 2 strategic advantages: collaborative work with suppliers to gather precursor material data and a genuinely target decarbonization roadmap, because now they know exactly where the emissions actually are. I want to make sure we don't lose the financial mechanics in all of this. So let's walk through an illustrative example. And I want to be very clear. These are not published LKA numbers. This is a work example to show how the euros actually move for a single supplier caught in exactly this kind of situation. Say that supplier reports EU default values because it hasn't invested in measurement. The EU assumes it's a punitive 3 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per ton, and at an illustrative ETS price of 80 euros, that's 240 euros per ton. Now, say instead that supplier invests in metering and reports verified actual data, even with zero production changes. Say the real number comes in at 2.3 tons, which is 184 euros per ton. On a volume of 50,000 tons a year, that gap alone is worth 2.8 million euros annually before a single lever gets pulled on the production floor. Then, layering on illustrative decarbonization levers, a renewable power agreement, fuel switching, an efficiency retrofit, you can see a path to roughly 1.35 tons of intensity, which starts to approach EU benchmark performance. This is the same measure exposed to carbonized logic from earlier in the session, just made concrete with numbers. Okay, let's zoom back out from that work example to the general principle, because this is the mental model I want you to leave with. Every ton of emissions you avoid has a known quantifiable value. It's the EU ETS price you would otherwise have had to pay in certificates. That fact alone changes how you should think about decarbonization spending. It's no longer a vague sustainability cost center. It's an investment with a calculable payback period equal to your capital expenditure divided by the tons of emissions avoided multiplied by your net carbon price. And just as Visit Carbon's work with LKE showed the value of prioritizing the highest impact suppliers, you should sequence your own investments by cost efficiency. Find the cheapest ton of avoided carbon dioxide first, and let those savings help finance the more expensive levers later. This reframing from cost to investment is often the single biggest unlock in getting the decarbonization budget approved internally. Let's move into the practical playbook, starting with data systems, because everything else we've discussed depends on having numbers you can defend. First, move beyond spreadsheets. Install metering at the process level for fuel, electricity, and feedstock, so your data is measured, not estimated after the fact. Second, standardize what you ask suppliers for. Mandate the EU's own methodology in your supplier data request templates instead of passively accepting whatever format they happen to already check. Third, insist on primary data specifically. Fuel receipts, energy bills, production logs, the kind of source documents that survive a third-party audit, not high-level averages. And fourth, maintain an audit trail throughout. Every number that ends up in your CBAM report should be traceable back to a specific source document. This is the foundation everything else in today's session sits on top of. Assuming your data systems are solid, the next question is, where do you actually find emissions reductions? Four levers, four levers tend to matter most across sectors. First, energy efficiency. Things like insulation and motor upgrade is often the lowest hanging fruit. Next is renewable electricity. Through power purchase agreements or on-site generation, directly cuts your scope to exposure. A feedstock shift. Lower carbon raw materials can be surprisingly impactful, as we saw in the illustrative example earlier. And fuel switching, moving away from your highest carbon fuel sources, rounds out the list. The call out at the bottom is the discipline point I want to stress. Rank these levers by euros saved per ton of carbon dioxide avoided, not simply by how many tons they avoid. A smaller reduction that's cheap to achieve should often come before a bigger reduction that's expensive. Sequencing efficiently is how you fund a multi-year decarbonization program without a single massive upfront outlay. Reporting accuracy deserves its own moment because it's the cheapest lever available and it's purely operational, not capital intensive. We've already established that default values are designed to cost more than accurate data, so treat reporting as a pricing decision, not paperwork. Get third-party verification done early, well ahead of your registry deadline, so it never becomes, sorry. Okay, so it never becomes a last-minute bottleneck that forces you into a rush error-prone submission. Watch your commodity code classification closely. This is really important. Filing under the wrong code is one of the most common and costly mistakes exporters make, and it's entirely avoidable with a careful review process. And build in a review step before every quarterly submission. A single misreported number can trigger repricing or open you to penalty exposure that a basic quality check would have caught. The fourth pillar of the playbook is financial and contractual planning, making sure the organization around your data and your emissions program is set up to succeed. Price carbon costs into your quotes from the start. Don't treat it as an after-the-fact tax you absorb once a shipment has already left. Build a CBAM buffer into your financial forecasts because EU ETS prices move with the broader carbon market and can shift meaningfully year to year. Add what I'd call a CBAM clause into your supplier contracts, making emissions data a contractual deliverable rather than something you request as a favor and hope arrives on time. And for your smaller suppliers who genuinely lack the capability to comply, offer support. Templates, training, guidance, rather than simply switching suppliers. Because replacing a supplier really solves an underlying data maturity problem. It usually just relocates it. Let's be direct about what happens if you get this wrong, because the consequences extend well beyond simply paying a higher certificate price. Customs delays are real operational risk. Incomplete or inconsistent data can hold goods at the EU border, disrupting delivery schedules and damaging trust with buyers. Contractual penalties are increasingly common as EU buyers write CBAM compliance directly into supply contracts, meaning non-compliance can trigger breach clauses. There's also a legal and reputational exposure. Misreporting emissions data, even unintentionally, risks fines and can cause lasting reputational damage that outlasts any one contract. And perhaps most consequential long term, loss of market share, as buyers quietly start prioritizing suppliers who are already audit ready over those who aren't, even before a formal requirement forces the issue. None of these risks are hypothetical. They're already playing out in procurement decisions today. Let's close our practical session with something you can literally put on our calendar. First quarter, map your exposure. Identify exactly which your product lines are CBAM covered and where current data gaps sit. Second quarter, get primary data. Install metering where you can and go directly to your top suppliers for real numbers rather than estimates. Third quarter, run a shadow calculation. Compute what you'd owe under actual data versus the default value so you can see the stakes clearly before they're locked in by a live submission. Fourth quarter, prioritize decarbonization. Rank your levels by cost per ton of carbon dioxide avoided and get started on a top one or two. And ongoing throughout the year, formalize what you've learned by building CBAM clauses into new and renewing supplier contracts. So this becomes structural rather than something you have to resolve every reporting cycle. As we wrap up, here are the four ideas I most want you to walk out with. One, measurement is money. Your emissions data isn't a side reporting exercise. It directly sets your CBAM bill euro for euro. Two, default values are punitive by design. And as recent Carbon's real work with Lidl and Kaufland Asia showed, emissions risk concentrates in a small number of suppliers. So accurate reporting and focused engagement there can save real money without a single process change. Three, decarbonization pays back. Every ton of emissions you avoid has a known calculable financial value, which means it belongs in your investment planning, not just your sustainability report. And four, perhaps the most strategically important, compliance is now a market access requirement. EU buyers are actively selecting suppliers based on carbon data readiness, which means getting ahead of CBAM isn't just about avoiding costs. It's about winning business that your less prepared competitors will lose. Thank you for all your time and attention today. I know we've covered a lot of ground from the mechanics of CBAM through the emissions to exposure to decarbonization model into a detailed case study and out the other side with a concrete playbook. I'd love to open the floor now for questions, whether that's about your specific sector's exposure, help getting started on primary data collection, or working through what a decarbonization business case might look like for your operations. We're also happy to continue this conversation one-on-one if that's more useful. Anyone? Yeah, I see the, there are questions in the chat box. Okay. Okay. Is embedded emissions the same as embodied carbon? Okay, not quite the same. Yes, that's true. Um, okay. Any more questions? You don't have to ask a question. You can share something that your company has experienced or is experiencing so we can learn from it. Anyone? Mm. I hope everything is clear and that you've learned something from this session. If there are no questions, I'll move on. Um, all right. We run free talks every Monday, either at 11 a.m. or at 8:30 p.m. Singapore time, covering a wide range of sustainability topics, and they are open to everyone. For more details on upcoming sessions, please check out our website at ecosustainability.group/events. Please join our LinkedIn and WhatsApp community for the latest updates. Let's stay in touch. And if you have inquiries, please contact Teng, Henry, Ariel, CD, and Sherina. They'll be happy to help. We'd love to see you again at our next session. Until then, take care and stay curious. Thank you once again, and have a good rest of your evening.